Linda Smith was smeared by the FBI, wasn't he, for his ideas on addiction. Do you think that that's even possible today, that the drug reform movement has a respectability that is well beyond that? In other words, how much has changed since those days?
You know, it's definitely changed in the sense that Linda Smith did have to deal with, people keeping a dossier on him. I don't know if there's a dossier on me or some other people like me. What does happen is more subtle, I think. It's the ways in which organizations check with the drug czar's office about whether they're okay with my being invited. And they may say yes, they may say no. It's ways in which they, it's that kind of more subtle sort of, it's now the government's just issued a request for proposals for work on medical marijuana, and researchers who want to do stuff are wondering whether or not they should formally link with Drug Policy Alliance, which would be very valuable for them in terms of information collection and our experience, but would it disqualify them from funding? So it's a more subtle sort of thing that continues to go on. It's not, I think, as blatant as it was with the days of Alfred Linda Smith in the 50s.
Now, the 21st Amendment, the end of prohibition, was in part brought on by the crash of 1929. To what extent do you think the global financial crisis is going to accelerate drug reform?
It will, certainly. I mean, if you ask what was the number 1, 2, and 3 reasons why alcohol prohibition ended so quickly in the United States, it was the Depression,
Yeah.
right? Everything else, I mean, there were a dozen other factors, all the crime and the violence, corruption, and everything else, and individual rights, but it was really that, and people saying, why continue to spend ever more billions of dollars a year trying to enforce an unenforceable prohibition when instead we could be earning the tax revenue? I think that with respect to marijuana reform, that issue does loom large. It was not the most important argument for people who supported Proposition 19 in California, but it was well up there. And it was also one that the media found very appealing. I mean, the media may have played it more than it actually was the case for the electorate, but it was a significant argument. One of the problems, of course, was that Prop 19 would have only produced a small amount of revenue because the federal government would have prevented it from being properly implemented, and because it was up to localities to tax it, and it was not as if you were going to suddenly switch to a legal regulatory system with a well-instituted taxation system there.
Was the financial part of it well argued? Was that one of the main reasons for those advocating Prop 19?
I think part of it was that. Part of it was the jobs issue. Some of the labor unions came out for Prop 19, which was quite a surprise, and they saw this as a growth area. And it's hard to unionize among illegal workers, but it is possible to unionize among legal workers. So you did have that. I think the other area where it's helping right now, the economic recession, the silver lining, is on the push to reduce prison population.
Yes.
Last year, 2009, was the first year, I think, in the last, 30 or 40 years, where the number of people locked up in state prisons actually dropped. And roughly 60%, 65% of the entire incarcerated population in the U.S. is in state prisons, as opposed to federal prisons and local jails. Last year was the first year it dropped, and I think the fiscal incentives were one of the major factors. It was helped by the fact that there had been a growing movement for reforming prison and drug policies. There were other factors that came into play, but that one certainly was important.
Now, in the talk that you just gave, you talked about how sometimes it's the right side of politics that support the principles of drug at the end of the war on drugs than the left, and I think that's also true in Australia. I mean, Muir was funded by the conservative side of politics in New South Wales. I've never quite understood how the US, that believes in the individual freedom and particularly believes in small government, particularly the Republican Party, how do they reconcile those notions with big government war on drugs?
Well, I think part of it is that each of the political parties is always a hodgepodge of coalitions, and for the Republicans, it's been on the one hand, representing the interests of the wealthy, which they've done an extraordinary job at. I mean, to get large numbers, tens of millions of relatively low-income people to continue to support tax and fiscal policies which disproportionately favor the top 1% of income earners.
Stuff of magicians.
It's remarkable. And if you look at the percentage of the national wealth that is now earned by by the top 1% of the population is, I think, triple or something like this. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. It's quite extraordinary. But remember, that party includes sort of free marketers.
Yeah.
It also includes cultural conservatives, Christians. It includes people who believe the world is going to come to an end in the not-too-distant future, the Armageddon. So it's an interesting coalition. I think that to some extent what happens is that for many of the ones who understand what's wrong with the drug war and who don't like the government being involved in this way, what they realize is that the political benefits of continuing to justify the drug war exceed the benefits of taking the opposite position. The other thing that happens is that you have some influential Republican leaders, and some of these conversations have happened privately, who essentially would favor legalizing drugs. But since that's impossible, they're uncomfortable with the in-between steps, the harm reduction things, the moderate sentencing, because those look to be soft on crime. So they basically said, if we could go from the war on drugs to legalization, I do it.
Sort of a purist position.
Yes, but I don't like that middle ground stuff because
Yeah.
it seems too liberal and soft.
Now, I've long felt very strongly in this country that the public are way ahead of their politicians on drug reform. I really do not believe that any politician in this country, at the beginning of their political term, any leader who articulated, a series of drug reforms would be punished at the ballot box, because it's a very pragmatic culture. Is that different in America still? Is the general middle America still?
By and large, remember, most of what politicians, it's not the fear of reality, it's the fear of what might happen, right? It's the fear that if you take a progressive position on a drug issue, that the opposition will come up with a horrific ad describing you as wanting to give drugs to kids, this sort of thing. Now look, you've had this issue happen in Western Australia, I think, right? Where you had, Western Australia embrace initially the cannabis expiation scheme and then repudiate that, and all sorts of horrific, politics going on around that. By and large, there's relatively little evidence that elected officials have been hurt by taking a progressive position on drug policy reform. One of the more interesting things in the most recent election was that Rand Paul, who is the son, Ron Paul is the congressman from Texas, Republican, very libertarian, who ran for president in 2008 and landed up raising more money on the internet than anybody ever had in a short period of time. And he's very much in favor of legalization. His son, Rand Paul, was the Republican candidate in Kentucky for the US Senate. He was attacked by the Democratic candidate for being soft on drugs. Kentucky has a big problem with methamphetamine. It did not keep Rand Paul from winning big. And I've not really seen it hurt people running for office elsewhere. And there's one, fairly classic case. Bob Barr was a right-wing Republican down in Georgia, fiercely anti-drug. And in the Republican primary, they ran ads accusing him of being, why was he wanting to send medical marijuana patients to jail? And he subsequently acknowledged that may have played a role in his defeat in the Republican primary. Yeah, so. Now,
I interviewed Norm Stamper last year from Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, and I asked him what he felt was the single biggest obstacle to drug law reform. And he nominated the prison industrial complex, the unions and the establishments behind the police.
Yeah.
Do you think that's true?
I think Norm's right. I think that the prison industrial complex is the most powerful force retarding most drug policy reform. And it's of different elements. Part of it is, and it requires a more sophisticated analysis. So for example, you have the prison guards unions in places like California and New York, which in California are enormously powerful. And then you have the private prison corporations, which are more influential in the South. I mean, thank God they hate one another, because if they ever got together, they'd be a really ominous force. One reason why the prison guards unions in California did not want new prisons being built while Schwarzenegger was governor was because Schwarzenegger said if he built new prisons, they would be privatized. Not privatized, they would not, they would be privatized. There would be no unionized prison guards. So now, when we ran a major ballot initiative in California 2 years ago that would have reduced the prison population by 20 to 30,000 nonviolent, mostly drug offenders, and that would have shifted $1 billion a year from prison and parole to treatment and rehabilitation, and held the corrections department to a new set of criteria. We took all the best recommendations of top, expert bodies. And in the final stretch, the prison guards union, put in $2 million of their own dollars. They raised another $2 million, and they beat us. They ran scare tactic ads. They lined up Democratic politicians. I mean, the real definition of power is when you tell somebody to do something, and they don't even ask why. They just go do it. And that's the political establishment in California and much of the rest of the US. When the prison industrial complex is unified on an issue and they say this is what we want, people don't even ask. If you ask the question, why did Governor Schwarzenegger just veto a whole bunch of harm reduction bills around clean needles or overdose prevention? Why did his Democratic predecessor, Gray Davis, veto same sorts of bills? It's because the people in this, oftentimes the prosecutors, just said, no, you can't do this. So in a way, the prisons guards unions are more about maintaining their overtime pay. And the prosecutors are the ones who are the most animated. They're the ones who I think are the most despicable in all this. They are the ones who have blocked sentencing reforms, harm reduction reforms. In America, we have an adversarial system of justice, and they're all about, being advocates for the laws, right? It's not about justice for them. I think with the police will privately express alternative opinions, but essentially there's no tradition to engage in internal debate. So with Prop 19, the cops said, no debate. You're either against it or we're against you. When Attorney General Holder came out and said, if Prop 19 passes, federal government's going to crack down to the full extent, many people think it's because big city police chiefs said, you better come out against this thing. So it is a powerful and venal force. I just hope, when you think back to President Eisenhower in January 1961, his farewell address where he warned about the political power of the growing military-industrial complex, I hope we don't have to wait till January 2013 or 17 for President Obama to give a farewell address about the growing power of the prison industrial complex or the emerging homeland security industrial complex.
See, I guess, strategically for the drug reform movement, you have to decide whether you want to spend your energy trying to change public opinion or whether you want to spend your energy trying to lobby, for example, prosecutors to change their views. Is that a worthy pursuit?
We're always making, those judgment calls, Gideon. It's for Drug Policy Alliance, the large part of our resources has typically gone into working on the incremental reforms in state legislatures and Congress, legalizing needle exchange, legalizing medical marijuana, legalizing overdose prevention programs, rolling back mandatory minimum sentences, rolling back drug-free school zone, laws that actually have no, deterrent impact, but that lock up people. So a lot of our effort has gone into that, a lot of the resources. We're now trying to devote more resources to really opening up the debate, and especially with something like marijuana, because that's really about opening the debate.
And there's a tipping point, isn't there, where you have enough public opinion where even the establishment has to take notice, is that?
Well, remember, we also have in the United States, in half the states, the ballot initiative process. And what that means is that in half the states, mostly out west, but a few out east, that when you have 55 to 60% of the public on your side, if you can raise the money, we can then draft a law, put it on the ballot, and win it. And that's how we won medical marijuana, that's how we won treatment instead of incarceration, that's how we reformed some of the asset forfeiture laws that allowed police and prosecutors to seize property without any due process and keep it for their own departments. And that's how we're going to land up legalizing marijuana in the first states, right? So that initiative process means that the public will get there, and then the politicians will follow.
Now, America is used, for the last 30, 40 years, it's used to getting its own way with drug policy around the world. Some would argue like a bull in a china shop. Now that we see a succession of countries in Latin America, countries like Portugal, the Netherlands, Germany, starting programs that they perhaps wouldn't have dreamt of 15, 20 years, to what extent does that have an influence on American policy?
It is having an influence. And remember also, the US government's changing. I mean, the Obama administration is different than its predecessors under the respective Bushes and Clinton and Reagan. There is some branches of the US government, including the international arena dealing with HIV, who are talking about harm reduction uninhibitedly. The drugs still won't use the phrase. The State Department can't get quite used to the notion that harm reduction is okay, but when Obama came in and the order was issued, we now support needle exchange. So all of a sudden they had to revamp their statements to say we support needle exchange, and quietly saying, look, we support harm reduction, just please don't use that expression.